Chapter 5. Road of Tears. Elizabeth woke up when her harem captor shook her awake. She could hear Jankar screaming. She was still woozy and her head was pounding. The harem jerked her upright and shoved the screaming Jankar at her. She put Jankar on her shoulder and started patting his back. Elizabeth wondered how long she'd been out. Then Jankar barfed on her back. The idiot watching her hadn't burped him after he finished eating. She guessed that she hadn't been out long then. Jankar finished burping and went to sleep. Elizabeth could smell field smells. They must be out of the city. She wondered which direction her captors were taking her. After about an hour, another harem crawled into the wagon so her guard could stretch. She was hoping he would get bored and she would find an opportunity for escape. If they changed guards frequently, this would never happen. It didn't help that she couldn't stare at him. Elizabeth would have stared, daring him to flinch, waiting for an opening to escape or attack. She could not be Elizabeth, though. She was a poor, scared girl from the country. Well, the scared part was real enough, but the rest of it was fake. To pass the time, she tried to remember everything she could about Tirza village. She spent a few weeks in eastern haremland with Zithni while her mother visited old friends and cousins. Harem being the harem, Zithni was related to many people. Elizabeth had a good memory, but even she couldn't remember all of her cousins. If these men were true harem, they might realize she was naming Zithni's family. She was one of the most famous harem of all. Elizabeth remembered a smaller, insignificant family who migrated in harem tents. They were currently living in Tirza. Elizabeth had played with a young girl her age in that family named Mitha. Elizabeth would have to be Mitha. Mitha, the country girl who had been sent to the castle to better herself with the Bithnian barbarians and to help the famous Zithni. It might work. Maybe. After a few hours, they passed through a little village. When they passed through it and were back on the road, the wagon stopped. Another harem, the first one, pulled the tarp off of the wagon, cut her leg bindings, and growled, "Get out." "Word will be out about the baby's capture now," he told her. "We need to travel fast now. You'll ride from here." Mitha the servant looked solemn. Harem were practically born on horseback, but scary warriors were ordering her about and a good servant girl would obey them. Elizabeth was excited. First, they thought of her as being unimportant, which meant they really had no idea who she was. Secondly, they were letting her ride a horse. She was Zithni and Josh's daughter. Let her get a few feet ahead of her captors and they would never catch her in the dark. She would have a patrol after them in no time. Elizabeth noticed that she had 12 harem escorts. Several of the white men at the castle were meeting them with horses. The harem leader mounted one of the provided horses. Another harem placed Jankar in her sling. Then the lead harem pulled her up behind him. A sulky Elizabeth leaned away from him so Jankar would not be squished, but it was Mitha who stifled a cry when the harem urged their horses into a gallop. Elizabeth judged his horsemanship. Mitha continued to be impressed by these tough warriors. Both Elizabeth and Mitha worried about Jankar. Jankar began to cry. "Shut him up," the man ordered. She felt his bottom. "He's wet, sir," Mitha said meekly. Elizabeth added silently, "You idiot." The man stopped in exasperation, got off, and lifted her down. He looked at her expectantly. "Do you have supplies for the baby?" she asked. "Later," he said, waving his hand. "Fix it." Elizabeth wanted to roll her eyes, but Mitha looked confused for a moment. "Please, sir," she said, "could I have a knife?" One was handed to her. She was very shaky and trembled as she cut part of the hem of her dress off. She made a makeshift diaper for Jankar and wrapped him back up. Then they were off. Even in the dark, her captors galloped fast. When morning came, they switched to secondary roads which were less traveled. Elizabeth became more impressed with them. They must have a large organization. At least once a day they were met by someone who had fresh horses for them. The horses had always been brought somewhere else and never stolen. This meant there was never any suspicion about the horses. Over the years, it had become common to see more and more harem in Bithnyia. No one thought twice of their party. On the second day, the leader brought her harem riding clothes. They were dark and made of tough material. Now Elizabeth would look like her captors. Their leader gave her a headscarf to wear. No one would look at her twice. "You may call me Zet," he told her. Elizabeth's captors kept to a grueling pace. They slept little and traveled long. Elizabeth knew even if the king's couriers got word of her kidnapping ahead of their party, it was unlikely she would be caught. Her captors were too good. She looked for escape all the time, but was never given a chance. Whenever they stopped, Zet made sure Elizabeth was tied to something and that she always slept with Jankar. She was only allowed to talk or sing to him quietly. She knew very few harem lullabies. Actually, none. And supposed English ones like "The wheels on the bus go round and round" would make them suspicious. Mitha became an expert at dripping goat milk into Jankar's mouth to feed him even on horseback. She even changed diapers on the move. They almost never stopped. Anytime they came to a village, Zet would hold Jankar. Just a nice merchant holding his baby while his older daughter ride behind his saddle. Mitha was always quiet. Elizabeth wanted to cry for help. She imagined the enraged villagers pulling her captors off their horses and killing them. Zet had a knife handy and would kill Jankar and then turn and slit her throat if she tried anything, so Elizabeth just cried for help on the inside. She was careful that Zet never saw any tears. It took them about 2.5 weeks to get to Trella. Elizabeth was pretty sure it was a record. Zet had them take the middle highway through Bithnyia. It went through Tithi and up through Trella. Elizabeth had actually never been to Trella. It reminded her of King's End, but it was much bigger and more sprawled out. She was little known outside the capital as she spent so much time in training. It was unlikely anyone would recognize her through her disguise. Zet certainly did not let them sightsee. As soon as they reached a seedy-looking inn, she was placed in a wagon with a false bottom. Whatever had originally been smuggled in it stunk. The weather had been turning colder. 2 days later, when they reached the top of Low Pass, they rolled through the checkpoint without stopping. It was a good thing the rain leaked into her compartment. It hid her tears. This was her country and her people. She was being taken away. Elizabeth wondered if maybe she was a real princess after all. A real princess would escape and save Jankar too. That's what Zithny or Melanie would do. Jankar started to cry. Outside, Zet smacked her compartment to remind her to keep him quiet. She held him tight while she cried to herself. "I'm sorry, Mom," she muttered. "I'm just not good enough."